All right, welcome to week 3. So before we started on today's material, does anyone have questions from anything from the past week since we didn't have class? No? Okay, so I also posted the final project requirement, so you can kind of check these out. Hopefully you got the email too. And they're pretty generic. It's geared towards you building an app on pretty much anything that interests you, just following a few requirements like that I kind of list out here, like having certain kinds of Ajax calls, having a minimum page requirement, having some tests, some of these things that we'll learn throughout the semester. So check that out. It is pretty open in terms of like technology. So like you can use Ember or React, both of which we'll cover. And because a lot of these like single page app frameworks, you kind of need a backend, right? And so far in this class, we've been using GitHub API, Reddit API. Those are like the two free ones. There might be a couple out there, but there's not a whole lot. So I end up always using those. So if you have backend experience, you're welcome to do that. But there's a really great tool called Mirage that we're going to learn throughout the semester, and it's basically like a configuration or a convention over configuration based like backend. It kind of the way it works is it kind of overrides the native class in the browser that's used to make Ajax requests, and so it kind of intercepts all Ajax requests you make, and you can say, here's an endpoint, and create data and sort of persist it in memory. It's really cool. It's really great for like testing and development, especially if like a backend isn't quite ready and you have to and you want to make your front end. I use it all the time at work for like the Ember app that I work on, and it's been made pretty recently. It's been made generic, so you can kind of use it with any technology, not just Ember. So that's usually what I go with, just because you can just kind of write out a few endpoints with very minimal code, probably like 6 lines, and have a full like RESTful backend. It just persists in memory. It doesn't like actually save to a database or anything, but it's good enough for like projects. So if you don't have backend experience, then I recommend just using that like we will in class. Yeah, so take a look at it, and if you have questions, throughout the semester, feel free to ask, and I can clarify anything. Okay, so what we're going to do today is we're going to look at a component-based framework called React, and so there's a handful of these out there, and components are kind of like the new building block for building UIs, and you can think of it kind of like a custom tag. So we're all familiar with tags, right? Like div, p, anchor, all these things. But a lot of these component-based frameworks allow us to define essentially like a custom tag with its own template, its own behavior, meaning interactivity, so JavaScript, and you can kind of create like these isolated building blocks and to kind of make up your application. And that's really what React is. It's just a set of components. Ember does the same thing. They have components, but they also have like a bunch of other things on kind of built into the whole framework. So that's where kind of some of these frameworks diverge. Is some will just do components, and then some will do components and other things. React is just components, but I think it's a great way to learn like what are components, and then you can kind of build it up to be a full single page app, kind of like Gmail or Google Maps, like those sorts of things. You can do that, or you can try some of the other ones. But I think once you learn one of these component-based frameworks, then it's really easy to hop into another one. So I've done mostly Ember, but it was really easy for me to pick up React because all the concepts were the same. It's just slight syntax difference, but for the most part, it's all kind of the same concepts. So that's what we're going to look at today. So if you didn't already install Node, I had a to-do here under week 2. Go ahead and head over here and just download it. I guess it depends when you downloaded it. If you have a kind of an old version, I would say like less than 7. That's probably old. So make sure you download probably like 8 and above, but probably 10 is ideal just because it's kind of the latest. A lot of these frameworks are also built on top of Node. So Node is like a JavaScript runtime to kind of build backends in Node, but then it's also used for a lot of front-end tooling. So to spin up a React project, there's like a command line, and it scaffolds out the entire project, and it does everything like having live reload and generates a little server so you can run it in the browser. Kind of a lot of these tools are built on top of Node, so that's why you need Node. But other than that, it's not used for like, at least in the context of React, to make a backend. So make sure you have that installed. And if you already, does anyone not have it installed? Oh, cool. Okay. So hopefully you just go to your command line and say node-v, you'll see, some version, hopefully 10. Okay, so I put links to kind of all the things that we're going to look at today. And there's a few different ways you can get started. You can install it globally on your computer, or you can kind of run it through this other command. I usually just install it globally. So if you want to go to, to your command line and say, let me increase this a bit. Okay, so if you say npm install -g create React app, and this is going to install this module globally on your system. You'll probably see this command over and over again as you install other global modules for different things. And that should give you a command line utility globally installed. So you should be able to type in create React app space -- version, and it'll kind of spit out the current version number of the one that you have installed. Oh. Yeah, I got a lot. Right. I always forget about this. So what you can't okay, so like the easy fix around this is just to run sudo npm install -g create React app. And this will just, it's because you have like certain permissions, and it tries to install it where it has permissions, and so you just kind of get around this by doing this. Yeah, so that should suffice for today. And then you can go ahead and try this command and see if it installs. If you actually click on this first link, their quick start's a little different. So they have like when you install newer versions of Node, they also install this other command called npx, and it allows you to run scripts without installing things on your computer. So you'll kind of see this probably it's pretty new actually, but I think this requires internet too. So if you're like on an airplane or whatever, you probably want to install locally. So this is another option if you don't want to install it on your computer. You can just do this, and it'll just run it. Okay, so I'm going to, let's see. I'm going to cd into my little folder where I put all the school stuff. Okay, so you can do the same whether it's on your desktop or documents or whatever. Yes?
What was your code for create React app? I didn't see that.
The code, oh. This?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Usually any global install command, you can do the command space and then -- version, and it'll kind of spit out the version. This is like a universal thing for the most part. Okay, so now I can scaffold out an entire project by just running that command and then giving it a name. So I guess I'll call this, let's see, React class. So you can call it whatever you want, but we'll go with that. And behind the scenes, this is going to run that. It's going to install a bunch of packages via this node command line installed. Yes. Sure. Yeah. Yeah. So create React app space and then whatever name you want to give it. So what we just did was, so I'll delete this. And if I do list out the entire directory contents, you'll see that it has this folder, and this is where it has like the entire project. So I can cd into that folder that I just created. So change directory into there. And I think it already does like an initial commit when you install the project. So that's why, like I've already set up my command line utility to tell me that kind of information. But if I were to say like git status, it says it's clean. So it does kind of like a git commit right when you install it. Okay, so let's take a look at this directory. So I'm going to open up my editor. So I'm going to open up VS Code and just navigate to the folder. So I'll say open. And let me change that theme again back to white since I think that was easier to see.
What does it mean to save workspace configurations?
I think that's a VS Code thing, so it's probably trying to save some settings for this project. So I guess you can just say yes. Because you can have like different sets of settings, I think, per project. So if you want them, every project has different conventions. So if anybody sees that, maybe just hit yes. Okay. Okay, so let's go ahead and run this now. So, or actually, before we run this, let's look at kind of what it generated. So everything that you're going to kind of, all the code that we're going to write is going to be inside this source folder, src. You can see here's some stuff. Public is for like, extra like third-party assets and stuff, or like icons, images, that sort of thing. Node modules, that's for third-party dependencies that get installed. So things like React. React is made up of multiple libraries. If I wanted to install Moment, I would install it and it would get placed inside this node modules folder. So if you open it up, it's actually pretty big, but there's a lot of things in there to make this whole thing run. And let's see. Okay, and so there's also a file called package.json. And so this is like a configuration file for third-party dependencies. So when they say dependencies, it's like libraries, so third-party libraries. And you can see they're listed under this key called dependencies. And so it's installing React, another React library called React DOM. So if I want to use React in the browser, you can also use React for like native things. And so there's another thing that you can install. I think it's called React Native, but for browser, which is what we're doing, we install React DOM and then some React script stuff. But this is where we would, like if we were to install Moment, we would kind of place a configuration option here and then install it that way. So anytime you have like, or anytime you see a file called package.json, you know that this is using Node and you can install it via Node. So we'll kind of learn more about this as we go.
How do we open it with whichever program you want to use again?
I mean, I just do file, open, and then navigate.
Okay, because whenever I try to look at it, like I'm using Sublime, whenever I try to find React-class, it's not showing on my computer.
I guess it depends where you put it on your file system. So if you can't find it, maybe create like a new one, maybe on your desktop, and then yeah, like if you're using Sublime, I usually just take a folder and just drag it onto like the Sublime icon. So.
But how can you specify where you want React saved to?
Well, you have to like cd into that specific spot. So like change directory.
Oh, yeah, I'm cding into it, but so if I just want to open up that file, now what command would I
Actually, Luca, maybe you could help. It's probably something I'd probably have to look at, but yeah, help him open up the project. Okay, so this is kind of like the scaffolding of a React project. Let's go ahead and run this. So if you go to your command line, you can just run npm start. And this is going to boot this up on a local server, so localhost :3000, and you should see a page like this. And so the really cool thing about this is it started everything for us. So there's a local server, but then if I were to change any of these files, it would automatically reload. No longer do I have to just do Command R and like refresh the page. Like it automatically does that. Okay, so let's kind of see where the code is that kind of generates this entire page. So if you open up the source directory, kind of the main entry point is this index.js file. And you can see that you're going to see kind of some funky looking syntax. And it's kind of a mix of JavaScript you probably haven't seen before, and then also this HTML-like syntax. And if I were to kind of look at kind of some of these other files like app.js, you're going to see, okay, there's JavaScript because I see a function with a name and curly braces and all that kind of stuff. But at the same time, you have like HTML like this. So like, what is going on? So React kind of created this whole like new syntax or language called JSX. And so I linked to it on kind of the second bullet point on the class notes. But it's kind of like this hybrid where it looks like HTML, but it's not quite HTML. And it kind of mixes the two since these things are so tightly coupled generally most of the time, right? It's like you have HTML, but if you're adding JavaScript, they're kind of interacting in some way. They're not really separate. So they kind of just go the approach of just putting it all together anyways. And so if you're to look at this, like you're going to notice probably some differences here. So you're going to see like div, instead of saying class, it's class name. And maybe you recognize this from working with like the class name property in JavaScript. If you don't, no worries. But kind of the essence is that it looks like HTML, and you can kind of put all this stuff together, and this is called JSX. And so this is like the primary way I'd say most React applications are built. There's another way you can do it where these things turn into actual function calls. So instead of saying like div, it's like probably a function called div, and you invoke it and you pass it like the properties or the attributes to it. Most people don't do it that way, but it is there most of the time when you see a React application. It is using JSX just because it's probably the most friendly. But so that's kind of like the one key difference between this and like plain JavaScript is like you're going to have this hybrid, and they're no longer separate. Kind of if we think about like handlebars, right? We created templates in the HTML file with that template tag, and then we had a JavaScript separate, and then we kind of combined the two. But here it just like puts it all into one single file. But yeah, so we kind of look at this, we're going to see there's some text. So it says edit source app.js. And if we were to go back to this page, you can see here's the text here. So everything what you're seeing is from this app, what they call a component. And so how is this thing kind of getting rendered in the first place? So if we're to look at this, we see kind of the index.js, which is the entry point to the entire app. And it says react dom.render, and it invokes this file right here, this app.js, which is a component, via like HTML-like syntax. And this is kind of like a function call. You can think of it kind of like if you were to do app parentheses, it's pretty similar. So you can think of components very much like functions. So components are these like custom tags with their own behavior, their own templates, and they kind of act a lot like a function where, with a function you invoke it, it gives you some type of return value. With a component, its return value is like a block of HTML or like DOM that you put into the browser. So you can think of, essentially components very much like functions. So there's also some other stuff in here that you're going to see. There's like this newer JavaScript syntax, these import statements, and this is not React specific. This is kind of more of just like a new JavaScript language feature where you can kind of import files. Kind of like if you think about a script tag, right? You have multiple script tags on a page, and that kind of brings it into the page. This is very much like that, but doing it from a JavaScript file. So if I want to pull in moment, I would do something like import moment from moment, and that would look it up through the file system. So if I were looking at this, we can see it says import app from app. So I'm giving it some name, app, from, and then the ./app is saying look it up in its current directory. So I'm inside this, like this index file is inside the source directory. I'm going to look in the same directory for a file called app.js. So that's kind of what this statement means. And kind of all of these do the same thing. These import statements, you can leave off the .js file extension. I think even if you add it, it breaks. So that's just kind of how import statements work. So yeah, we're kind of like rendering this app to the root of the page. And let's see. If you were to open up public and then there's this index.html file, this is like the final index.html file that is getting served. So you can see, the title here is React app, and you can see it right here. So this is like the HTML file, so you can kind of do those standard things. You'll see that there's a div here with an ID of root. And if we were to look at this piece, it's getting that element by the ID of root and saying, let's render this app component in that space. And then from here, it goes to the app component, and the component is really just a function that returns some HTML or JSX and kind of spits it out onto the page. Any questions just kind of looking at this? So we're going to kind of build something pretty similar to what we did in week 1, so where we had like those GitHub users and the GitHub repositories. We're going to do some AJAX calls. We're going to just kind of do that in React because it's not, an app you're sort of familiar with. So we're going to start off actually just by modifying some of this and deleting it. So if I were to just kind of, modify this right here and add some text and hit save, you'll notice if I go back to the browser, it automatically reloaded and did that for us. So it's really nice. It has the live reload. Okay, so I'm just going to delete pretty much everything inside there, and then we're just going to start from scratch. Okay, so there's some other things in here. We can just kind of get rid of it. Okay, so if I were to kind of go here and just say, just type in some plain text, you're going to see that it kind of, at least via the code, they're going to, let's see. Okay, so if I refresh, you can see it on the page. So I have some text there. Now there's some styling associated with this already, so I'm actually going to go inside here and also delete this too. So I'm just going to go in here and just delete it all. We'll add some our own custom styles here, but we'll do that later. That's also another kind of interesting thing in these is that in these JavaScript files, you can also import CSS files that are specific to this component. So that's why you're seeing like an import to CSS, and this way it gets like scope to this. Kind of another interesting, like React kind of goes and they went like at least when it first came out, it went in a completely different direction that was kind of mainstream, like really pushing like what the conventions were. Okay, so let's start off by let's do like an AJAX call, right? Because that's a pretty common thing on a web page is you fetch some data and you render it onto a page. So let's do that. So you can write these React components in functions like this. This is one way. Another way is using kind of classes, And I'm gonna start off using classes just because it's kind of like the mainstream right now, and then we'll kind of look at functions later on. But actually, let me do this. So I'll comment that out. And so to kind of make this into what's a class, so a class is like this general container. It's like an object where you can have all these different functions. And but let me kind of start off. I'll type out the equivalent of this app function in a class. So I'll say class app extends react.component. And then every class is going to have a render method. And this render method will return this JSX block. So I can say return div, and I'll just say like hello. I know there's going to be a lot of new syntax with like new JavaScript syntax that you've probably not seen before. That's how I felt too when I at least hopped into Ember for the first time, because there's like all these new JavaScript features coming out, and they kind of take advantage. A lot of these frameworks take advantage of them. So please like raise your hand if you don't really know what any of them are, because I'm pretty sure the other classes didn't go over them. So. So you can think of like this, if you're not familiar with classes, it's like this, it's this concept where you can have like related variables and functions grouped together in this one construct. And that's kind of like the short of it. There's like a whole class on classes and object-oriented programming, but we'll just kind of learn it as we go. So generally, so we saw that components are functions, so they return some HTML. The class is really the same thing, but it has a render method, and that's what returns the HTML. So if we were to kind of go back to our page, we can see hello being rendered on the screen. Okay, so as part of like a component's lifecycle, they have a few different methods that you can add. So when a component gets added or inserted into the page, when things update for the component, or when the component or node gets removed from the page, there's all these different functions that we can kind of hook into for when those events happen. And so one of them is the component did mount, and this is a lifecycle function or a lifecycle method. Also, yeah, terminology. Functions defined inside classes are typically called methods, but yeah, I might use those interchangeably. So this is something specific to React, and right when this div gets inserted into the page, this will get called. Okay, so I'm going to actually delete this, move this back up. Okay, so let's open up the, let's see, I think it's API dot, what is it, GitHub. Okay, so api.github.com/orgs/ember.js/member. So this was the endpoint we used in the first week to get a list of members, and we can take it and display all their avatars. So we'll go ahead and do the same thing. So I think in week one we used $.ajax, so just jQuery's Ajax method to do it. And that's one way to do it. But today we'll kind of look at another method built into the browser for doing these Ajax calls, mostly because I would say for a lot of React applications, like if you're just using jQuery, or if you need jQuery for Ajax, it's probably not the right library to choose. You can kind of leverage other things that are smaller, because there's no point really in kind of incurring the cost of the weight of all the jQuery just for the Ajax utility. So you're going to probably see a lot of React applications that don't use jQuery. So I kind of wanted to expose you to other forms of making these Ajax calls, even though, $.ajax, if you see jQuery, it's very common. So what we're going to look at is called the fetch API. And let's see. So if you'd open up the console in a browser, there's actually a method called fetch. And so this is this is one of the methods or functions built into the browser for making these Ajax calls. And that's what we're going to use today. Okay, so the way this works is we can say fetch, or we can say window.fetch if you want to be explicit. But if you don't specify the window dot, it's just implied to be called off of, or it's implied to be global, so being pulled from window. So if I were to just kind of save this and let this run, and if I were to view the browser, you're going to see that it did make this fetch call to this endpoint. You kind of see the data. So kind of a one-line function, which is really nice. Okay, so the way this works is this returns us, so you can call .then on it. And when it makes this call, it's going to resolve, this asynchronous call is going to resolve with a response object. And this response object is also asynchronous, and it's kind of weird because you kind of have to do this. So you can say return response.json. So it does some like deserialization or something, and once it gets back the entire response, and then from there, then we can kind of chain on another then call. Oops. And we get access to the members. So I've already do a console log here and do members. Then we'll see the members. So there's some other methods that you can do on the response object, but honestly, I've really only used called response.json because most of the time you're working with a JSON endpoint and you want to turn it into JSON. But this thing is kind of asynchronous. So if we were to look at this and go to the console, you'll see all these members logged to the console, and then we could actually do something with it. Now, since we learned about async await, let's actually convert that to use that just because it makes the code a lot nicer to read. So if I were to kind of rewrite this, we're going to add the async keyword in front of the class method. And then we can say let response is equal to await fetch that thing. And then I can say let members is equal to await response.json. And I can do a console log on members. I'll comment this out. So this is like the equivalent using the async await, much cleaner, more terse. Okay, so if I were to save this, check out our page, we still see all these being kind of rendered to the screen. Whoops. Any questions? Okay, so in terms of like order of execution, this component gets mounted onto the page. It renders this block, but at the same time, like right when it gets rendered, it fires off this component did mount. So when the element gets kind of mounted onto the page, and then it fires the AJAX call, and 1 second or 500 milliseconds or however long this takes, this will come back with the actual data, and then we need to tell this component to re-render. So we're going to set this property kind of on this component, and then in here we're going to have some logic, kind of like the handlebars logic, to kind of loop through and spit out some image tags for each member.
Yeah, so when you say the second version is better than the first version?
It's kind of, I guess, just, I wouldn't say better. It's just personal preference. I would say it's like more terse, less code than this. So, but it's honestly roughly the same.
So what's the return type of the response variable?
Of this, yeah, there's a I put a link under here, so on the fetch. So that fetch call will return a kind of an instance of this response class. So if you want to look into it, and this response class has some methods like JSON, error, like some other things there. Honestly, I've really only used JSON, but you can check out what some of these other ones are for. But it's like an instance of this response class.
So the second call .json is still asynchronous?
Yeah, it's kind of weird because it's like this makes the call, so it already has the data, but for whatever reason, the browsers or they decided to make the process of turning like this response into data that your app can actually use asynchronous. Now, I don't know why they did that, but they did. Yeah. Any other questions? All right, so I'm going to delete this. Okay, so when this gets loaded onto the page, it's going to render. Then this hook is going to. I also might use the word hook. So they're like lifecycle method or hook. You might hear them interchangeably, but this lifecycle method will get called. The AJAX call will fire. I'll get the data, and then we need to tell this component to re-render using the data that we now have. So how do we do that? So what we can do is we can say this dot set state, and so set state is a method on React components, and it takes an object. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to say I want to set the state to I want like there to be this this property on my component called members. So I'm going to say members : members. And one new, nice new JavaScript feature is if the left-hand side of an object, if like the key is the same name as the variable on the right, you can actually just delete this and just do that, so it's even cleaner. So we're going to set this property on this React component called members, and then we can go inside here and render it. Okay, so how do we go about rendering it? So we use these curly braces for dynamic data. So if I wanted to say, let's just do like the length. So I can say members.length. Oh, whoops. Okay, so inside this render method, I don't actually have access to the members variable that I stated here. So this actually gets set on a property called this.state and then the property names. So when I say set state, it's going to put it on a state object, and then I can access it here. Okay, so we're going to get an error. It's going to say cannot read property members of null. Anyone want to take a guess as to why this is happening? So when this component renders for the first time, so even before this whole thing has fired, it's going to try and render, it's going to try and access a length property off of members, but that has never kind of been declared for the first time. So we're trying to access like this property off of null or undefined. And so that's kind of like why we're getting it. So what we need to do is whenever we kind of use these state variables, we kind of have to initialize the state. And we do that in what's called the constructor. So the constructor method gets called right when this component is created. So not when it gets rendered, but when it gets created for the first time. And so here we can say this dot state is equal to an object. And usually, like in this case, members is an array, so it's probably good to initialize it as an empty array because that's how it is initially, and then it'll get populated later on. And then one other thing that we have to do is we have to call super props. And so kind of when a component gets invoked or instantiated for the first time, it gets a handful of attributes. So kind of like if we were to go back to this index.html file, we see app and then slash, or you know what, actually, we can actually probably just remove this for now. We can get into this later. Okay, so if we were to look at this, we can see that it says 30 on the screen. So if I were to refresh this, you can see that it's like there's a flash between 0 and 30. And that's so like when we say this.state.members, it's saying 0 from the initial, but then once this asynchronous API call finishes, the members becomes 30, and then it automatically re-renders. So an interesting thing about this is I didn't actually have to go into the page and say anything like document.getElementById.innerHTML is equal to 30 or the new value. It just automatically updated, which is kind of like what all these component-based frameworks do is you just kind of change the data and the framework will automatically re-render when the data changes, which kind of makes things very convenient. You don't, if you've ever been on like some websites and you notice like sometimes you have like, you notice like inconsistencies between like maybe your inbox says like, I don't know, 30 unread emails, but then you've actually read them all and there's like a disconnect between the two. And that's usually because maybe like in the codes, there is nothing to update it every time an email gets read. And so like there's this inconsistency between like how many it says over here and then how many it shows over here. And so the nice thing about these frameworks is that they automatically re-render when the data changes. So like it fixes those types of bugs. Okay, so refresh again, 0, 30, everything's kind of looking pretty cool. Okay, so let's maybe put this in a paragraph. So I'll say P, and I'll just say something like members. Okay, so let's make another div, and then we're just going to put every member image inside of here. So how does this look? So we kind of know that we can use these curly braces for dynamic data. So I can say, I'm going to make another set of curly braces, and I'm going to say this.state.members. And we're going to call this function on arrays called map. And so what this kind of does, it's kind of like for each. But actually, you know what? Let's kind of go through. Maybe I'll show an example of this because. Okay, you don't have to type this or anything, but Okay, let's say I have a variable called a, and I'll just say 1, 2, 3, 4. So here I can say a.map, and the map function takes in a function, and it will invoke this function for every item in the array. So I could say, I can just call this item, and I can say console.log item. So we can see 1, 2, 3, 4. So it's a lot like for each. So what's the difference between this and for each? So the interesting thing about this is map allows us to specify a return value. So I can say just return 1, and so the result of items is the return value from each iteration as we loop through the array. So in this case, we're kind of looping over this array, and I'm just returning 1 for all of it. So this items variable becomes 1, 1, 1, 1. So that's kind of like what map does. So it does take into account like this return value so that I can do something with it. And that's similar to, well, unlike for each, the return value isn't actually used. It just kind of goes through the items. Map is for the case of where I do want to take, like I want to map this array to something else. So maybe one example is I want to take this, I want to say, I want to multiply each number by 2. So I can say return item and multiply it by 2. And then so each one is 2, 4, 6, 8. So this map function this exists on arrays, and this is particularly useful for React for when you have a list of things and you want to render that list. So these curly braces, I can pass it the result of map, and it will render each thing. So in this case, I'm going to kind of map over it, and for each, so we're mapping over the members. And then what we're going to do here is we're just going to do an image tag. So we'll say, we'll say this, return image source is equal to okay, so let me actually look at the data again. Is it avatar URL? So here we can say return an image for each one, to set the source to the dynamic property avatar underscore URL. And so we're returning each image, and then React will kind of take this array of images and render them onto the screen. And we're getting kind of like a little warning here. It's saying image elements must have an alt prop. So maybe we throw this in and we say alt is equal to member dot login. And while we're at it, let's do a width of 150. And that should be good. Okay, so if I save it, and open it up, you're going to see that we get all the images. Okay, so we are going to get this warning. So kind of each child in a list should have a unique key property, and this kind of has to do with like how React renders things efficiently. So kind of the shortcut about it is just saying key is equal to some unique identifier for each one. Now, if I were to look at this endpoint in each member, the ID is pretty unique. So one way you can do this is just say member.id. And this is for like React keeping track of things for when it has to re-render and stuff. But the details aren't like terribly important for now. So that'll just kind of get rid of that warning. So key is equal to something unique. You can even use like the index from the loop. That works too. Any questions? So far we only have one component. We have like this app component and we're just doing everything in here. So this works. I mean, it's a pretty small page and we're not doing a whole lot, but we could actually break this up into smaller components that do like their own individual thing. So maybe one thing that could be useful is breaking out this image tag for a member into its own component and maybe calling it like member image. So let's go ahead and do that because then this will kind of show you like how you can subdivide your React applications into these smaller components of your choosing. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to just create a new file in the source directory. And I'm going to call this member image.js. So it's up to you kind of what you want to call it, but yeah, a lot of times in these apps, you can make like all these smaller components that are really focused on like one thing and one thing only. Yes.
Is the convention to like capitalize the first letter if it's a component?
Yeah. Usually it follows this I think what they call title casing. Okay. So it's just every word's first letter is capitalized. Yeah. Okay, so we can make this a class, or kind of like we saw when we had when we first installed Create React App, and it kind of had that app component as a function component. We can use a function too. Generally, like let's do this one as a function component, so you can kind of see it. In this case, it's going to be just a very simple component. It's just going to spit out an image, and I'm going to give it a member as its argument, and it's going to spit out an image for that member. So I'm going to say function member image, and we do need to import React from React, so include this line at the top. So I'm going to just copy it from the other file. And I forgot the parentheses. And I'm going to say return so one argument that we're going to pass, so we're just going to pass this component a single argument, which is the member, and it's going to return the image. So I'm going to copy this image tag here, and just paste it here. So it returns image. And then inside app.js, we can say return, and then we're going to invoke this component. So kind of like with the app, when we had, there was a tag inside that index.js file for like that HTML-like syntax, we're going to say return member image. So one thing that we need to do is we need to pass it the member, right? Because we're invoking this component, but it doesn't have access to this. So the way we can do this is we can say member is equal to member. So that's kind of the first piece. We're going to pass in this variable as this, and internally the component will also call it member. Now you can call this something else if you'd like maybe we call this user. You could do that too, but I think in this case maybe member is kind of nice. Which piece?
The member image.
Oh, yeah. Okay, so here we're kind of getting an error. It says member image is not defined, so we need to import this into this file, otherwise we don't have access to it, and it's going to give this error. So going back to the top, I'm going to say import member image from, and then in this current directory, so I'm in this app.js file, it's in the same directory, so I'm going to say member image. So I'm pulling this in so that I can use it down here. Now, one last thing that we actually have to do is in this member image component, anything in this file, it's sort of like private to the outside world. So from here, like nothing in here is actually exposed in this file. And we need to explicitly say which things do we want to kind of expose to modules that import us. So in this case, I want to expose this thing. And so the way I can do that is I can say export default. And this is just like a JavaScript module thing. Because I'm saying like the default thing when I export, when I say something like import whatever from the file name, the default export will be the thing that gets returned. So this is just kind of like a JavaScript feature, and you'll see this like in Node or other technologies, but okay, and then actually one more thing. Okay, so we look at this, got some issues there, but we'll fix it. Okay, so these tags, they can have multiple like attributes or properties, and we can pass them in like this. So I could say A is equal to 1 and kind of go on like this. And so all of these like key value attributes or properties, they get collected into what's called properties, and that's what this function actually receives. So it doesn't actually receive the member. It receives properties, and for short, they're oftentimes called props. So the member is just a property off of this props object. So I can say let member is equal to props.member. And if we were to kind of console log props, you're going to see that it's an object that contains kind of each member. Okay, so we're going to look at this. We're going to see here are the props, and you can see it has member and each member, so everything's at least getting rendered. We kind of got the key problem again, but we'll fix that. But I'd say kind of the takeaway for here is components, they have two things. They have props, which are like the attributes that are passed to it, kind of like this. So if I were to kind of, I could add in more like attribute-like things when I invoke a component. And then components also have state, which is like internal properties that the component like creates or modifies, or maybe there's like computed things. So maybe if you were like, maybe you had a component for calculating an array of numbers. You give it an array. The component will do the calculation of maybe summing up those numbers. That would be another example of like state. So state is just like internal properties or things derived from the props, like a sum. But components have props and state. So props are things that you pass into the component. State is kind of like internal to the component. Okay, so let's kind of go back and fix this key error, and then we'll kind of take a break. So, okay, so each child on the list should have a unique key prop. So the problem is now each one of these has a, the key actually needs to be on the outside. So we need to kind of go back here and say key is equal to member.id. So we're going to kind of just move it up a level because it's the thing that's being returned from each iteration. That's what needs the key. So I'm going to add that here and then delete this here. So we'll delete that from the member image. and then add it to here. And that should take care of that. So we go back. No errors. We can see all the images being rendered and everything pretty much looks good. Okay, so I'm going to delete some of these console logs. Okay, so let's take like a 10-minute break and then we'll question, yes.
Why is it that you don't need quotes around the braces and the properties?
Around the braces in the prop.
It's like in the member image where it says key equals. Why don't you have member ID in quotes?
Member ID in quote. Oh, this in quotes?
Outside the braces, yeah.
Oh.
How you would do it in HTML.
Oh, like this. Kind of like this.
Yeah, because I did that and it didn't work.
I think that's just like React's way of like binding dynamic data to properties and stuff. Yeah, it does kind of take some getting used to this because it's like it is weird mixing the HTML with the JavaScript at first. Any other questions? Yes.
Can you just explain again, like, why you have to pass the key in the statement where you're like returning the member image?
Yeah. So like the thing that's being returned from the map, each one of those elements, like they essentially need like a unique key, I think, for like efficient rendering inside of React. But and that's why when we moved it, like it was here originally, but that's not the direct child that gets rendered. This is, and so this is the one that actually needs it. It's like the thing higher up, the thing like the immediate thing being returned from map. Yeah. I read into it once. It had to do with like, has to efficiently render, but it was very like detailed. So probably don't need to worry about it now. Any others? Cool. So when we come back, we're also going to do what is it? The repositories, and we're going to make some other optimizations here. We're gonna add like loading, little loading indicator, because so. Yeah, let's do like reconvene maybe 7:15. All right. Let's kind of get back to it. Okay, so I think so we have an app. We have two components, app and member image, and it just fetches some data and renders onto the screen. And so I think one nice feature that we would like to have is loading, right? So it'd be nice if like while this thing is happening, because I think if we were to refresh the page, it says 0 members and then they kind of flash in. Let's just kind of maybe do something that says loading, and then otherwise we'll get everything rendered onto the page. Okay, so the way we're going to do this is we're going to declare some state, and we'll just call this variable called loading, and we'll say loading is equal to true. Then kind of later down into the render method, we're going to add some logic that says if loading, then we're going to show some text that says loading. Otherwise, we'll kind of render everything. So similar to what we did in handlebars, just via React. Okay, so here we're going to have this loading variable true. So right when this component gets created, it's in the loading state. And then we're going to add, so kind of once we do the AJAX call finishes, we're going to set this loading variable to false. So we're just kind of here just changing some data. So just loading true, loading false. Okay, so kind of going back to handlebars, it was really nice where you could say like, if loading, else /if, and then kind of do your logic there. It was very like declarative and pretty readable, even if you weren't familiar with handlebars. In React, it's a little different, and so to conditionally render things, it's using just actual JavaScript, so you can use like if statements. And there's like two types of if statements. You can have one where this is kind of like your standard one, right? We have if curly braces. So this is kind of like one way of having an if statement. There's also something called a ternary statement, and it's like a shorthand if. And you'll see it pretty common in React because it's pretty nice for like these conditional rendering things. But this is kind of what it looks like. I could say let b is equal to, let's see, let's do this. So if a dot length is equal to 4, question mark. So if that's true, then we're going to set b to, I don't know, the string true. Otherwise, use the colon, and then you can say it's equal to false. So it's kind of the same thing. It's just kind of like a one-liner if statement where the true condition, or you have the condition, then a question mark, then if that condition is true, this is the value that b will be, and if it's false, then this is the value b will be in the falsy case. Yes?
What's the difference between the 3 equal signs and 3 plus signs?
Oh, the 3 checks for the type and the value. So you could have things like, you could say like 1, like a string 1, and then 1. So if you were to do like 1 is equal to 1, I think this would actually be true. Like it tries to coerce the types into the same thing, so it'll like convert this one to a number. Whereas the triple this will say false because they're not the same types. So it's generally like a good practice just to always use triple. And a lot of these like linters and editor things will they'll have features in there that'll just say, hey, you're using like double equal instead of triple equal. It's more explicit, and then you don't run into like these weird bugs where it's like it tried to coerce the type into something and then you weren't expecting that. So yeah, it's just one of those things. Just always use triple. Okay, so this is kind of that ternary statement. You're going to see it in JavaScript. It's in PHP. There's probably lots of languages that have it, but it's like a shorthand if. And you'll probably see it all over React applications too. So this is what we can use to kind of like conditionally render. So what we're going to say is we're going to say this.state.loading and then question mark. And then so we'll kind of show some text that says loading. Otherwise, we'll go ahead and do this stuff. So if I were to save this and then go back to the page and refresh, you can see you get kind of the loading ... and then it renders. Now we can even make this another component. So let's go ahead and do that so we can see another component. So I'm going to go into my source directory and right click, create a new file, and I'll call this loading.js. And in this file, I'm going to import React from React. And we'll say export default function called loading. And here you can, do whatever you want, whether you have like a div with some crazy CSS. We'll just say, I guess we can do that. We'll just say div loading ... So in this case, I kind of used a function for a component just because it's kind of there's no state involved, and generally that was the pattern for when you had components. Like if you just had a component that was just to kind of like break up bits of UI. So like kind of like if you're familiar with includes in other languages, you want to like include this piece over and over again in different spots. Like you would break it out into a separate file and put it, so you could reuse it. Function type components were nice for that. And so you can just kind of like have this reusable loading component and put it wherever you want. And so not too long ago, it was the case where, if you had state in your component, kind of like in this case, we have state for the app component, I would use a class. And then for any other type of component, you probably just use a function because it's a little simpler. React has kind of added something recently, so you can have state in components, in function components, but it's something we can look at later. If you just happen to Google, you might come across this thing called like React hooks, and so you might see that, but yeah, we haven't gotten there yet. So for now, we'll go with functions for components that don't have state, and then classes that do have state. Okay, so let's go ahead and change this. So instead of this text here, I'll just say loading, kind of invoke it like a tag. And then I will import this at the top. So we can say import loading from loading. So like one thing you could also do is actually even turn this into its own component too. So maybe you create another component called like member list, and but we can save that for later if we have time. So if we go back and refresh, everything's still working as is. Any questions? Yes.
So, say if I have some data that I want to access in every component, is there some kind of like global state or global variable?
Oh, it's like something in every component, like this loading thing, like if loading.
I guess if I want to have some state like that is useful in many components.
Oh, like state.
Yeah.
So like I guess it depends, like if you're talking about the state or the stateful logic. Like
I guess it's just like a global variable.
Like, yeah, in that case, then you could probably have that as state for like this app component, and then you pass it down into kind of all of these components. It's like, a pretty common way of doing it. I think there's other ways too. I just, I would need to look into it. Okay, so we can close some of these. All right, so let's go ahead and do the one where we fetch the repos. So I think it's, instead of /members, it's /repos. So we'll go ahead and fetch this, and then we'll kind of, do the same thing. Actually, let's see. Okay, actually, before we get to that, let's do one other thing. So in our source file, it doesn't have to be just components. So one thing I like to do is create a new file for like reusable functions. So in this case, I'm going to create a file just called GitHub API.js. And I'm just going to remove like all the calls that are related to fetching data from the GitHub API into this file. So here I am going to create a function. So we'll say export. We're not going to say export default, and I'll explain why. But I'm going to say export function, and we'll have a function called get members. And so this is going to be an asynchronous function. And we're just going to kind of move some of this logic into this separate file just for like separation of concerns. And, if we want to, do kind of reuse this type of logic elsewhere, we could have a single place where we can just call this function. So I'm going to copy kind of what's inside this component did mount lifecycle hook and just paste it in here. And at this point, we can just return members. So this function will be an asynchronous function. We just call it, and it returns us the list of members. And we can even make this kind of like more generic. So instead of it being tied to Ember.js, we can make this as an argument that gets passed to it. So we'll call this like organization. And then we'll just replace this so that this way it's, you know, more reusable. So I'm going to change these into backticks and then replace this with the kind of the syntax so that we could put a variable inside of a string. So organization. So as a refresher, backticks kind of let you put variables inside strings using this like dollar curly syntax. Yes?
Is there like a short key for backticks?
No, it's just at least on my computer, it's the left hand, like near the escape key. Yeah, kind of one of those weird characters I never really used until this feature came out. Okay, so let's add this to app.js. So now I can kind of go back and delete this and say let members is equal to await get members, and we'll pass it Ember.js. So we've kind of like shifted some of the logic, so at least this component is a little bit leaner, and we have this nice reusable function. Now, if you noticed, I didn't say export default, I just said export and then this function. And the reason for that is, oh, it actually already automatically did that. That's really cool. So it actually auto-imported it for me because it saw that I was using something in another module. But you can, oh, whoops. Uh-oh. So where is it? Okay, so it may have added this for you if you're using VS Code. If it's Sublime or Atom, it probably didn't. But you can see that it has curly braces here, so it's kind of like an object. So it's kind of pulling in a specific function using this. And so when you have like a default export, you just use like one variable. But if it's like multiple things that you want to export, then you can kind of use this like object-like syntax and say I want to import get members from this file. And then I can, this gives me room to like add other functions that I want to export from this file. So inside like a file, you can have like a default export, you can have and multiple things that are not default export. So it's just it's really just how you want to like structure the file. Any questions? So let's make one more function. So we're going to, I'm actually just going to copy this one. And we're going to call this get repos. And I think the API call is /repo. So it's very similar. But it's instead of /members, it's /repos. And then here, I'm just going to say repos to rename it. You could actually even, well, actually, we'll just leave this. Yes?
Could we potentially do this in the same function where we have organization and like
Yeah, I mean, that's another way to break it up. I guess it's kind of up to you how you want to do it. Yeah, that could be better, yeah. Okay, so as like a class exercise, take 10 minutes and try and do the same thing. So call the get repos function from the app component and render the list onto the screen, also using that same like loading components, or when it's loading, do the same. And for the properties in terms of like what to render here, let's see, let's go with name, description, and there's one called archived. Let's see, where is it? Archived. Oh yeah, and then there's a Boolean called archive. So if it's archived, just write the keyword archived, and if it's active, or if it's not archived, then just put active. So yeah, take 10 minutes to do that, and then we'll kind of like do it together. So it should be similar to kind of like what we did before, but it'll help build like the muscle memory. Okay, so I guess we can do it together at like 7:45. Okay, so we're going to use that get repos function and render kind of that data inside the app.js component, and we're also going to show the loading component while it's fetching the data, and we're going to show these three properties, and we'll also create just a custom component called GitHub repo card for each repo item. Okay, so I think the first thing we can do to start off is we'll just create a file called GitHub repo card.js. So this will be a component, and I'm going to copy the import React, and we'll say export default function called GitHub repo card, and it will take in props, and here we're going to just return some HTML. And here we can say let repo is equal to props.repo. So kind of back over here when we have the data, we're going to invoke it like, we'll have another loop, but we'll invoke it with, instead of member, but it'll be repo. So we'll go ahead and do that. But let's kind of, I guess, finish this one out first. So we'll add a paragraph tag, and we could say repo.name. I'll just copy this a few times. Repo.description. I'll say repo.archived, and we'll use that kind of ternary statement. So if it's archived, we'll just put the string archived. Otherwise, we'll say active. Okay, so that should be it really for this component. So now we're going to come back here, and we need to fetch that data. So we're going to say let repos is equal to await get repos for Ember.js. And this function will return that data once all that comes back. And then we're going to set it as state. So the data comes back, and we're going to put it as a state property on this app component. And so similarly, where we initialize the state as an empty array, we're going to do the same for repos. So we're going to set it to an empty array, and then the data comes back, and it'll have, you know, like 30 items or something. So in this case, we could have done the same thing and said like repos : repos, but since they're the same key, we can just kind of shorten it a bit. And then going over here, I'm going to copy this same loop that we had, this little expression, and just make another div and paste it, but I'm going to slightly modify it. Instead of members, I'm going to change it to repos. So this .state.repos map over each one. You get a repo, and then instead of using member image, it will be GitHub GitHub repo card, and then I'll change each of these to repo. And I think so it needs the same key kind of thing going on to for React to keep track of things. So I'm going to just say repo ID because it looks like in the JSON there's also an ID for repos. So and the last thing we have to do is import the GitHub repo card component at the top. We'll go back up here and we'll say import GitHub repo card from GitHub repo card. And if you save it, I think that should be it. Okay, so let's check to make sure this works. Yeah, and you can kind of see all the information. I see archived. There's probably an active. So we could add some styling to make this a little easier to read, but any questions? Okay, so there's a couple like random minor things I want to change about this that so we can improve this app a little bit. And the first thing is if we look at these two asynchronous calls when this app component mounts to the page, it does, it waits to get all the members, and then it waits to get all the repos, and then it sets a state. So if we were to look at kind of this network panel inside Chrome, and if you click on this XHR button or filter at the top, it'll filter down all the requests that were AJAX requests. And you can see like here, there's the green like waterfall. It's like a bar chart, and you can see it first. It's doing the hover. Well, you can see it's doing the members, and then right after members, it fetches the repos, right? So it's like it's doing one after another. And in theory, there's no dependency between these two AJAX calls. Like you could just fire them off at the same time, and when they both come back, then you want to do something with the data. So kind of moving that repos bar also to the left. So we can do that, and there's a nice kind of function for doing this built into the browser for dealing with like multiple asynchronous calls. And the way this works is we can say let data is equal to promise.all, and this promise.all function, so this is built into the browser and into the Node runtime, but it takes an array of promises. So in this case, I can say get members, comma, and get repos. So I'll comment these two out. And so, and then we can say await. So we're going to wait. So promise.all will kind of resolve when all the promises in that array have also resolved. And then we'll have access to it here. So in this case, down here, we could say like let members is equal to data dot the first item. So it returns like an array that's the same order as the one that you passed to all. And then you could say repos is equal to data1. And so this way, if we were to do it this, if I save it and go back to the page, you can see it did kind of solve that problem, right? So it does them, kind of fires them off at the same time. So performance-wise, in terms of like when this page loads, it's a little bit better. Any questions? So generally, promise.all is nice when you have like multiple asynchronous calls and they're independent. But when there is a dependency on one and the next, then you would probably want to kind of go with a more like the first approach. So wait for the thing to come back and then maybe use this data for the second call. But in this case, that wasn't necessary or even needed. So we just fire them off at the same time and just get back a single promise when both of them have resolved. Yes?
Can you explain a little bit more why you chose 0 and 1?
Yeah, so this thing returns promise.all resolves with an array of the data in the same order as the array that was passed to it. So in this case, members was 0 and then repos was 1. So just like the array index. And so that's where these came from. Now there's also a nice like JavaScript feature to clean this up a little bit because it just, I don't know, it's like 3 lines and you can shorten it to even like 1 line. So okay, so kind of looking at this example again, we can use something called array destructuring. And the way this works is you can kind of use that array-like syntax to kind of pick out pieces. So it's like kind of matching this pattern against this pattern. And so you could say, in this case, there's an array with 4 items, so I can kind of destructure the array by putting variable names, and it's going to match up A to 1 and then B to 2. And you could also do like C to 3, D to 4. So kind of knowing this, so this is called array destructuring, and you can actually even do it with objects too, which is actually really cool. So you can say like, if I were to have like, maybe if I have a person, and it's an object with a name, David, school, USC. We can actually use this same like destructuring technique and say like, let name and school is equal to person, and then if I just kind of, the name and school variables will be David and USC. So in these two cases, like this one was using the curly syntax to kind of destructure an object, and in this case it was using a bracket to kind of destructure an array. So it allows you to like pull out data from a array or object as opposed to having to say like person.name and person.school. I can kind of pull these out into their own like separate variables. It's not necessary, but it's kind of a nice feature, and you'll probably see it if you were to like click on links and stuff. So kind of going back to this example, we could actually clean this up quite a bit and say, instead of saying data 01, I could destructure this and say members, repos, and kind of get rid of that. So it's just kind of a nice like one statement to fetch the data and then pull out the data too at the same time. Any questions? Okay, so let's style the repo cards just a little bit, just so you can kind of see how CSS interacts in all this, because it's a little different. So if you look at this, all the data is just being dumped onto the page, and actually, if you open up your console, you may have a link in here that says something like, check out the React Dev Tools. Do any of you see that? Yeah, okay, click on that link. I already installed it, so but click on it and it's going to install it for you. It's a Chrome extension. So just install that Chrome extension, and then you're gonna have to, I think you have to open it up in a new tab. So just like close this one and open up another one. Yes.
What do we need to install?
Open up the console and you're gonna see like a link in there that says something like install the React Dev Tools. Yeah, so it's a Chrome extension, and make sure you're using Chrome. Yeah, so once you install that, close this tab and open it up in a new tab. And then you'll probably see this orange icon in the upper right-hand corner of Chrome. So it says React Developer Tools, has access to this site. And so if you click it, oh, okay, I need to actually zoom out. Okay, so once you open up this page in a new tab, you should see these things in the Chrome console. And so that's, so if I click on components, it's gonna give you like an entire tree of all the components in your React application. So if you look at this, you can see it says like, here's the app component and it's made up of a bunch of member image components. You can see those keys, and then kind of later down you'll see here's the GitHub repo card components. And if you click on one of these, you can even see like what the props were, so the data that was passed into the component, and you can look at it. So it's a really nice way to like get an overview of just the component tree of your app, and to see like what data was passed to it and all that. Okay, so let's go to the GitHub repo card, and on this div, let's add a class. Now, if I say class is equal to repo-card, you're actually, I think you're going to get like a syntax error or a compiler error, and it's because in our files, right, these are JavaScript files that kind of mix HTML and JavaScript. But if we were to look at the app.js file, it has the keyword, we're using a JavaScript feature, a class, right? And so if we also put a class here, it like doesn't know how to distinguish them. And so then for all your attributes, they use what's called like the JavaScript equivalent. So if I were to let's actually go to another page. I'm just going to go to a random page and inspect. Let me find something. Okay, so like I'm on some random page and I've selected the body, or I select, okay, let's select this nav pusher, like div. And if I were to go here, side note, here's like a neat little trick. If I want to reference this element in the console in Chrome, I can say $0. Then it'll kind of give me access to this based on the one that's highlighted. But if I go here and I can say like $0 and say .class name, it's going to give me access to the class via JavaScript. So this is like the JavaScript equivalent of getting access to an element's class. And so if I were to do the same with, say, the body, so I select the body, go to the console and say $0 class name, you can see it gave me those two classes. So it's giving me the class attribute value. And that's what React uses for all attributes. It uses the equivalent of the JavaScript like attribute name, not like the HTML one. So here we have to say class name instead of class. So when you have like, you have a block of HTML and you want to turn it into a React app, it's not so much you can like copy and paste it and put it inside like your render function. You actually have to change like some of the names of these things. A little annoying, but that's just how it works. I think class name is probably the common one, so it's almost like a find and replace kind of thing. Okay, so repo card. See. Okay, so we added class name repo card here. So now we can, if we were to inspect it in the elements panel and just kind of inspect one of these, we can see now it does get turned into class equals repo card. And we can go to our app CSS file and we can kind of style this. So we could say repo-card. Let's just do like border bottom 1 pixel solid black. Maybe add some padding, I don't know, 20 pixels. But you can just put your regular CSS in here. Save it.
Where did you add the class name again?
Oh, the GitHub repo card.js file, so at that root element. And so if we go back, we can see we got some styling here. I know like the first time I started playing with React, like that was a pretty common error where I would say class equals something. I'm like, like you get this compiler error, and I think it, actually let me verify, but if I were to change this back to just class equal, I think it turns into an error. Oh, maybe it doesn't. Unless they change that, huh? Okay, let me restart the server and see if that. Oh, that's nice. Maybe I guess, yeah. Maybe you can just use class. Oh wait, here we go. Invalid DOM property class. Did you mean class name? So. Cool, so I think that's it for the React. So now I think the last thing we want to do is let's deploy this somewhere so it's viewable in by a public URL. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to Control C, so I'm going to stop the server. And if you click on the README file, it's going to have a bunch of instructions for different things you want to do. So we were running npm start to kind of run the thing. If you want to run, you want to like build it and package it all up, because if you look at our app, we have like all these separate files and the node modules directory, and so like we can actually bundle this all up into a single script tag and build out the HTML instead of shipping like a bunch of files. So we can kind of build this and then ship off like the couple files, the HTML file, the CSS, and the JavaScript, and publish that somewhere. So we can run the npm run build command from to do that. So I'm going to clear. So I'm going to run, so if I run ls, right, here's my current directories. Now I can say npm run build. So this will build it out. And so now if I do ls, you're gonna see that there's a new folder called build that was created. So now I can cd into that build directory, and if I do ls, you can see here's kind of like the final build of this application. You can see like there's the HTML file, the favicon. Whoops. Let's see. Static probably has the JavaScript, so if I were to list out what's inside static, you can see here's the CSS and JavaScript, so it kind of builds it out for us. Okay, so now we've built the thing. So there's a lot of different ways you can publish this. You could like upload this directory to your Aludra account, since you guys have free USC hosting. It's very limited if you don't know about it, but like you can host like some basic HTML, CSS, and JavaScript files, and the URL is something like scf.usc.edu. If you're interested, I can show that to you later. But let's see, Surge. One service that I kind of like is this Surge SH, and it makes it really easy to like publish assets to a URL, and it's free. It's it's good for like test kind of stuff like this. So the first thing you have to do is install Surge. So you would say npm install -- global Surge, and we kind of did the same thing with React. So you would say npm install -g Surge. So this is kind of like, that was the shorthand of this. You can say npm I or npm install, or instead of just -g, you can say -- global. But the same thing. So if you install this globally on your computer,
Does it matter if it's within the building or not? Just
no, yeah, it doesn't matter where you're doing it. Yeah, whenever you run npm install -g, it just installs it globally on your computer. And now you can run the command surge just like it says here. And you want to make sure you do this from within this build directory. So I'm inside build, and if I do pwd, so you can see where I'm at, here's the project /build, so make sure you're inside that build directory. And then you can run surge, and this will just kind of like upload the thing. Oh, that's kind of cool. Okay, so you can even change the domain. I think like it has to be .surge.sh, but like these things, you can actually change this to something unique. Now, it would there's probably there's been a lot that's probably already taken, so you're probably limited. I'm just going to use the default. Oh, unless somebody else did this at the same time. Well, let's see. Oh, there we go. Cool. So hopefully you got this success. You can copy this domain, paste it here. Now you can see the React app. And I think, yeah, it even works over HTTPS, so you can do that too. But a really nice way for publishing like static sites. And they also have like paid plans, so if you want to kind of do a, I think yeah. I've only really ever used the free plan for school stuff, but you can probably do a lot more with it. Any questions? Oh yeah, quiz time. Oh yeah, so pop this code in. Yeah, so for anyone new, this is just, it's not recorded for part of your grade. It's just fun participation stuff. All right, so everyone do it. Yep, cool. So, yep, data passed to components. So, like members and repos, those were called props. So, props for properties. Oh, I don't know if I covered this one. Yeah, I didn't cover this, but like the render method, we always like return div and then stuff inside of it. But so that's actually a requirement. If we actually go to, let's see, where is it? Like if we did, so if we did this, yeah, it'll even give a suggestion, say adjacent JSX elements must be wrapped in an enclosing tag, so it needs a root element. But yeah, like the messaging is really good in React. Like that's one thing I found. Like it tells you exactly what to do if you don't have that.
You don't have to include like root.
It has to be a root element. Yep, cool. Most people got it. Oh, I didn't go over this one either. I was gonna do it and then I canceled it. I'm gonna skip that. Like, yeah, side note. So like the GitHub API has rate limiting. So if you make too many calls to it within a short amount of time, then it's gonna just give you an error. And especially as a class, if we're all doing it and we're constantly making changes, you'll easily hit that limit. So I kind of took a break on purpose. So there was another way around it to kind of like cache it so that we can continue, and that involves some environment variable stuff, which I turned out I didn't need. So yeah, so I cut that. Nice, good job. Let's see. Okay, so for the assignment, you're going to basically do the same thing for the subreddit, but build it in React, and I changed the requirements slightly. And so you're going to fetch the data, and you're going to show the title and the URL, and it's going to link to it. When you click on the title, you'll show the description and the score. Ups is another property, so you can format that with commas. And so using this function. And yeah, so same, you'll have some logic around num comments, and you'll also display the banner background image in some way that you think looks decent. And while the AJAX request is pending, go ahead and show some kind of loading indicator using one of those spinners, and at the top of the screen, show the subreddit subscribers at the top. So I kind of discovered this. Someone pointed it out to me, but like the subreddit subscribers. Let's see, what is it? Reddit. Yeah, this value is the same for every single entry, so it doesn't really make sense to show it multiple times, so just show it once at the top of the screen. So it's up to you how you want to break things out in terms of like what components you want to use. You know, that's kind of every developer's choice, whatever you think makes sense. So freedom for that. And you're going to upload it to GitHub, and you're also going to upload it to Surge so that we have like a URL to click on. Yes.
I'm trying to find the description.
Oh, for this?
No, in the Reddit, yeah, description of.
Oh. Oh, maybe it was something else, and I mistyped it.
It is under. Well, there's like a description under like all the words sometimes, but there's no description of the actual thing. There's a lot of things under the list before this.
Let's just cut it then. You know what? I was probably looking at like the GitHub API and then easily like mistyped it. So we'll just scratch that one.
Then just like Control F for description, but it's actually in the media, not the post.
Wait, where is it?
Some in embedded media on the Reddit API there's descriptions, but not all posts have embedded media.
Oh,
So-
okay, yeah. Let's just cut the property. So one less property to display. And I think that should be it. Any questions? Are there other questions? So I'm going to modify this a little bit because there's a few things that I cut. But yeah, next week we will kind of continue with React, and we're going to do more like interaction. So like when you click on something, how do you handle like user events? So with that, I guess, yeah, see everybody next week.